Thank you for the introduction. And every speaker started as an anecdote. So I will try to have one to have a first card for the topic I'm assigned for is rising China a threat? Since I came to the States about over 20 years ago, I have found many Americans, just like many other people, have a problem or difficulties to tell Chinese from Japanese, for example, to distinguish different nationalities among Asians. So they call them all either Asians or Chinese. And at dinner last night, the person sat next to me, and not want to tell who is that person, told me that he retired from an inner city school some years ago. Just before his retirement, the school has become very multi-ethnic, not immigrants from Africa, from Latin America, and from Asia has come to school. And some school kids are making some troubles. He posed a threat to those troublemakers that don't mess up with me. I will tell. In fact, those kids can have kids from Vietnamese, from Vietnam, from Japanese, from Cambodia. These kids call all those kids from Asia Chinese. So he said, I'll tell Chinese. They all know Kung Fu. So I don't know the threat from China is that China or that kind of threat. But in any case, talking about if is a rising China a threat, this is a very complicated question. There is no simple answer to this question. In fact, in the U.S., many people are anxious about a rising China. Many people in China also are concerned about if U.S. will try to keep China down. Indeed, in the U.S., although I have been in this country for many years, the early years when I was in this country, people were concerned about a weak China or a China regime collapse. In fact, that was particularly true after Tiananmen Square in the late 1980s. In recent years, there has been a marked paradigm shift in the American thinking of China from weak China to a strong China. This paradigm shift has brought about a profound policy debate about how to respond to the prospect of China emerging as a great power. Ever since taking the office, this administration has struggled to define its stance on I think, the most critical long-term challenge to the United States, whether to view China as a strategic threat and plan accordingly, or view China as a strategic partner and work with China to shape the future international system. We can easily find representatives of both perspectives from the administration. In fact, the policy toward China has come through swings toward one side or the other in the last 5 years, or in fact, last 20 years. When the current administration, the Bush, came to office, he called China as the previous administration called China a strategic partner. So he reversed the previous administration's policy and called China a strategic competitor. During his first year in office, he took much tougher stand on China on many issues, such as Taiwan issue, and also tried to put emphasis on our allies, tried to downgrade the importance of China. In fact, he criticized the Clinton visit to China had nonstop, did not stop in Tokyo, did not stop in Seoul. So he promised he would go to our allies first before if he was ever going to China. The September 11, in fact, changed the dynamics and softened the administration's policy toward China because the U.S. had to deal with more urgent dangers in other parts of the world and had to work with major powers, including China, to build a global coalition against terrorism. So in that case, in fact, 1 month after September 11, President Bush went to China at the APEC summit in Shanghai, nonstop. Although he promised he would go to Tokyo and Seoul first, but he canceled his trips to Tokyo and Seoul and nonstop to Shanghai. Made his first visit during his first year. From that September from that October to next October, he met 3 times with a Chinese president. That was unprecedented historical record of frequency. Next year in the spring, he went to China again. In fact, I heard his advisor said he should go to Tokyo and Seoul. He said, should we add Beijing to the list? Then the next October in the APEC summit in Chile, he invited Chinese President Jiang Zemin to stop in his Crawford ranch. Had very good barbecue, I think. And he proposed to constructive, cooperative, and candid relationship with China since then. However, as China continues to rise as a global power, American anxiety about a China threat has continued to rise. I can understand the concern for sure as how a rising China will use its influence is still an unanswered question for sure. In fact, especially at both global and regional levels. At global level, as many speakers discussed yesterday, and also you had a conference earlier, that China now has been searching energy and other resources at a global stage and has tried to lock up, use a metaphor, has to lock up energy supplies from many parts of the world, including pursuing deals with countries under U.S. sanctions and all with U.S. security concerns, such as people mentioned yesterday, Venezuela, Iran, Sudan, those countries. So this development has raised concerns, of course, among some Americans about if China is challenging the U.S. dominance in those parts of the world, and also raised concerns among some people. This is challenging U.S. efforts to promote democracy, human rights, and transparency. In fact, last weekend, I had a conference in Bahamas, a workshop there. Those people were so angry at China's actions in those areas. In Asia Pacific, it's still not clear what is China's aspiration in this area. We all know that this morning we had a history talk. China was an ancient empire in Asia Pacific, in Asia, in East Asia especially, during the early years before the Western powers came to China, and dominated this area and established what scholars call a tributary system. Chinese empire disintegrated and collapsed after a very dirty war called Opium War in 1840 to 42. And that war brought China empire down and also made China very weak for about a century. Now China is rising again. And in that case, it's not clear will China seek greater security by developing a sphere of influence over its periphery? When the U.S. was rising, we had a Monroe Doctrine to make sure that America became our backyard. So will China do the same thing in Asia Pacific? If Chinese capacities enable Beijing to challenge U.S. strategic relationships in this area, although some people, yesterday, David Sharma mentioned that that is not the case at this moment. But if that is the case, the likelihood for both heightened U.S.-China conflict and a region-wide instability will grow. In addition, the following three aspects of development inside China have also added the uncertainty. First is the lack of transparency on China's rapid military modernization program. Next speaker may talk about that in more great detail. But the question is very, very uncertain here because China said it's trying to develop its military forces commemorate to its economic modernization. Then the question becomes, if China becomes a leading economy, it's going to that direction in years to come, will China also become the most powerful military power in the world? So that's not clear. And China never told us what is its intention and what is its long-term plan for military modernization. Let me quote one QDR. In fact, my next speaker requested me to quote something from QDR because he did not bring the text. I have the text here. that QDR said, secrecy develops and envelopes most aspects of Chinese security affairs. The outside world has little knowledge of Chinese motivations and decision-making of key capacities supporting its military modernization. So that's a problem. Second is the concern about the recent rise of Chinese nationalism. In fact, Chinese people has a very deep-rooted sense of so-called victim mentality there. They thought they were humiliated by the Western powers when they were weak in the last century, or last 100 years, since the 19th century to 20th century. In that case, many people are concerned that China's aspiration for great power status, drawing upon strong nationalist sentiments, is a source of international aggression and would make Chinese foreign policy irrational or inflexible. It is not difficult to find evidence to support these concerns. For example, last year, if you read newspapers, more than 20 million signatures, Chinese signatures, were gathered on the internet to protest Japanese application to become a member of UN Security Council. And also in next April, so many thousands of Chinese demonstrators marched on the streets of Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou to protest what they saw the whitewash of historical atrocity of Japan in their textbooks. And Japanese Prime Minister's visit to Yakusuni Shrine, and the Japanese pledged to work with U.S. in case, to protect Taiwan, defend Taiwan, in case China attacked Taiwan. And also for non-Americans, I think you might still, it's still fresh for Americans that in 1999, when U.S., NATO force incidentally bombed the Chinese embassy, so many Chinese students demonstrated in the front of U.S. embassy through eggs. I think the astonishing thing is that it was so quick and so automatic conviction that this bombing was deliberate. So that was very astonishing, I think, for many people. The third concern is China's reluctance to open its domestic political competition and remain a non-democratic regime. Many in the West believe that authoritarian government is more likely to launch a war against each other and also Western democracies. In that regard, also another concern related is that it came very recent years. In fact, last weekend we also discussed about that issue about so-called Beijing consensus. That is to develop economy, high growth of economy under authoritarian government with political stability is a very good model for many third world countries, developing countries. This so-called Beijing consensus is in direct confrontation with so-called Washington consensus. We want to have a free market system together with a liberal democracy. So those are conflicts point. So these developments internationally, domestically, have, of course, given rise to a sense of fear among some in the U.S. about if China would become the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, or Germany in the 19th century, the Soviet Union in the 40s, Germany in the late 19th century, to challenge the international system. However, I'm glad to see that these kind of concerns have not stopped the U.S. from working with China over a wide range of issues involving U.S. interests, such as the maintaining progress in the six-party talks, combating WMD proliferation, supplying expensive goods to U.S. consumers, and responding to the growing non-traditional traditional threats to international security, such as poverty, disease, those issues, because these two countries have a complicated relationship with a mix of cooperative and competitive interests. President Bush acknowledged the complexity of the relationship at his conference, a conference in May last year, when he said the relationship with China is a very complex relations, and Americans ought to view it as such. In a speech on September 21st, last year, Ambassador Lilly mentioned that speech last year. Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick made a very eloquent, I think, statement about the complexity of the relationship. On the one hand, he criticized China's involvement with troublesome states and its mercantilist attempts to lock up energy supplies, resources, and urged China to adopt democratic reform. And also, one point I find is interesting, he challenged the realist view of the Chinese leaders by suggesting that the true partnership would depend upon the development of common interests, not only common values, not only common interests. I think that's very fresh for the Chinese leadership. On the other hand, he disagreed with those who view China, what he said, solely through the lens of fear, and encouraging China to become what he called a responsible stakeholder, working with the U.S. to sustain the international system that has enabled its success. Last year, just after that speech, I went to Beijing with a delegation from our center. I found Chinese are happy, very excited about this speech because they believe that this invitation as a responsible stakeholder, for them, this is the first time this term is a very good term, they like it, indicates that the Bush administration, just as the previous 6 U.S. administrations, has come to see China as a strategic partner. And they particularly like Zoellick's remarks that China of today, let me read one paragraph there, China of today is simply not the Soviet Union of the late 1940s. It does not seek to spread radical anti-American ideologies. It does not see itself in a twin-night conflict against democracy around the globe. It does not see itself in a death struggle with capitalism. It does not seek to overturn the fundamental order of the international system. So that's what they they're really happy to read that. Because Chinese leaders, I think, to be fair to them, just like their counterparts in the U.S., have hoped to maintain a friendly and a cooperative relationship with China. Because China's continuous rise relies heavily upon to have a favorable or peaceful international environment. Among them, the most important is to have a cooperative relationship, or at least a workable relationship with the U.S. So that's in that case, they are very sensitive to what the China threat theory, they call that. In fact, just before I came last Thursday, I received a letter from a very senior Chinese official because our center will have a conference this year. I titled the conference as The Challenge of a Rising China, Implications for U.S.-China Relations. They feel very uncomfortable about this title. And we have a co-sponsor in Beijing. The head of the co-sponsor is a former Chinese ambassador, is Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Ministry. He wrote me a letter, protest that. He said, if I can still read that, the construction of relations of cooperation between China and the United States is the responsibility of both sides. But the title, he said, my title, indicates intentionally that China is held responsible solely, as if all challenges coming from China's development. This somehow echoing to the fantasies of China's threat rampant in the U.S. recent years. So I became a target of criticism because of the title. So you see how sensitive they are. Last Thursday, in fact, last Thursday morning when I came to my office, I had a very early morning meeting. When I opened my computer, this came as attachment, and also a fax in my fax machine. What I should do that day. These kind of concerns, I think, is also understandable from their perspective. You try to put in their shoes to understand their thinking for sure. And because China is also very concerned about what is U.S. geopolitical intentions in Asia Pacific, to see China as an ally, a rival, or enemy. They are not sure about that. In fact, when we talk about China's threat in the U.S., when I discuss with Chinese colleagues, they also talk about U.S. threat from their perspective. In fact, this threat came most from two perspectives. One is what they also talk about structure or potential structure conflict between a rising power, China, and incumbent superpower, the U.S. So they are concerned if the U.S. would try to do everything to prevent China from rising as a peer power. Another conflict is a so-called ideological conflict. Between China as a largest nominal communist country and U.S. and Western democracies, particularly the U.S. They are concerned U.S. would try to subvert Chinese political system and regime in the name of spreading democracy. So in that case, although many in the U.S. claim that the main point of frictions with China is ideological, and they press for human rights, democracy in China, Chinese have wondered whether or not conflict will remain and grow, perhaps starker, even if China rises to become a democratic, as they are not sure if the U.S. wants to see even a democratic China to become richer and stronger than the U.S. So in that case, Chinese leaders have made a two-pronged strategic response to the China threat in the U.S. On the one hand, they have adopted they call 韬光养晦, height, brightness, and lowers obscurity policy designed by Deng Xiaoping in the early 1980s. This policy emphasized that China must keep a low profile in international affairs, bide its time, never take a lead, and build up its capacities. And China has tried to avoid confrontation with the U.S. In fact, some friends told me that China has to learn to live with hegemon, with the U.S. On the other hand, while making those accommodations, China has also tried to find its place in the world by promoting they call multipolarization, multipolar world, and in which China occupies one pole of that world. So in that framework, China tried in recent years build a framework of strategic partnerships to have bilateral partnerships with all major powers: Russia, European Union, Japan, many other countries. And that kind of framework, China has tried to appeal to their counterparts to abandon what they call the Cold War mentality and actively identify common interests, very realist view, by the way, with the hope that differences and contradictions in political systems and values will not affect the healthy development of state-to-state relationships. To facilitate these type of relationships, China also proposed some new concepts, such as China's peaceful rise concept. They tell their neighbors and major powers, China's a peace-loving people, China's rise will pose not threat, but opportunities for major powers and its neighbors. And Hu Jintao, Chinese President Hu Jintao, recently also proposed a new concept of, they call the harmony of world. In fact, in last UN speech, he made a very, very important speech, a detailed description about so-called the harmony of world. Two major points in this harmony of world is, one is to respect and tolerate different ideologies and social systems. Second is consultation among all countries involved, not unilateralism driven by hegemonic ambitions. Of course, that refers to the U.S. In conclusion, I will argue that due to the pervasive mutual suspicions, China threat, U.S. threat, the future of U.S.-China relationships is profoundly uncertain. The China threat, U.S. threat, concepts themselves are a threat to healthy development of this very important bilateral relationship, because it could lead to a dangerous confrontation that might divide the whole world into a new Cold War. Dangerous. So let me quote another quote to end that speech. Aaron Friedberg, who was the former senior advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, indicated in the fall issue of International Security, said, whether for good or ill, the most significant bilateral international relationship over the course of next century or next several decades is likely to be that between the U.S. and the PRC. As far reaching as its impact is, I think leaders in both Washington and Beijing have to demonstrate their wisdom to help overcome the pervasive fears of each other and to demonstrate their political skills to communicate with each other on sensitive issues such as the China threat, U.S. threat, to assure that China's rise produces cooperation, not confrontation, to the years to come. Thank you.